public health. So I am, by no means the first researcher to ask these questions. We have a large body of evidence showing that walking and cycling for transportation contributes to physical activity, which is of course good for a number of downstream health outcomes. And we also have research showing that things like investing in walkable built environments, investing in bike lanes, can help facilitate that physical activity as part of daily travel routines. And so these questions and the research that has answered them have been a motivation for my research, a lot of research and a lot of practice about this kind of relationship that I show here, this idea that we can invest in the built environment and infrastructure in a way that supports active transportation, makes it safe, makes it convenient, and then encourages physical activity and the public health benefits that it provides. So this is kind of the basic relationship that I'm taking as a starting point, and these two questions that I'm taking as a starting point. But I'm going to critically examine them or re-examine them through the lens of social equity. So I'm going to kind of complicate these two questions and our potential response to the relationships that underlie them. But first, I think it's helpful to review the general connections between transportation and health, kind of as a motivating exercise. Why do we care about this? And we care about that because we have, at the risk of sounding a bit negative, created a lot of environments that look like the one represented in this image. We have done a pretty good job over the past, for the better part of a century, to create environments that really foster automobile dependency and make us reliant on cars for mobility. And this has contributed to a number of negative health outcomes and consequences for our communities, including impacts beyond health, but the health ones have been pretty widely recognized. So what are these outcomes? Automobile dependency has contributed to high levels of physical inactivity. 2/3 of adults in the US currently fail to meet the Surgeon General's physical activity guidelines. Only 5% of adults are active every day, and a full 25% have not been active in the past month. This in turn has contributed to rising levels of obesity over time. 40% of adults and nearly 20% of children in the US are obese. And again, this level has increased steadily and pretty dramatically over time. Third, in terms of pollution exposure, even though air quality has improved considerably since the 1970s due to the Clean Air Act and other regulations, 41% of US residents still live in counties that fail to meet air quality standards for either ozone or particulate matter, which are influenced in large part by motor vehicle emissions. And we're becoming more vulnerable to unhealthy air days due to heat spikes brought on by climate change. And then finally, an important element of health is safety. And in 2018, an estimated 40,000 people lost their lives to car crashes in the US, and this was a 14% increase from just 4 years ago, before that statistic in 2014. So these are health outcomes that are not exclusively caused by automobile dependency. There's certainly a lot of factors that go into this, but these are some of the key ones that we think about transportation investments having an impact to influence in one way or another. And so what these observations have done is to encourage us to, rather than build environments that look like the one in the background here, to create environments that look like this, that support alternative, multiple modes of transportation, walking, cycling, public transit, as a way to help people integrate physical activity into the context of their daily travel routines, to make these choices safer, more convenient, more attractive, and really to make the healthy choice the easy choice. And again, we come back to this relationship that's kind of foundational to this idea that we can change the built environment in ways that support active transportation and that support public health through that activity. But I'm going to start complicating this now. And so looking at this image, you might imagine that it's not necessarily representative of where everyone walks and cycles. And the people represented in this image are not representative of the full diversity of pedestrians and cyclists in our communities. And we can imagine that not everybody is walking or cycling in an environment that looks like this. And so what this means is I think it's really important to consider social equity in these conversations about building walkable and bikeable built environments, that this relationship might hold on average, but how does it look for more vulnerable members of our communities? And so what I'm going to do in this talk, and what I propose doing in my research in general, is to take these two questions that I originally posed and just tweak them a bit and say, rather than asking if active transportation is healthy, asking if it's healthy for everyone. And then rather than just asking if infrastructure investment can support public health, can it do that in an equitable way? So I'm going to go through each of these questions in turn, and I have two research projects for each of them that kind of help illustrate what some of the concerns are from the equity perspective with the way that we typically talk about active transportation and health and infrastructure investment and health. And a lot of my research recently has been on biking. So you'll notice that most of the studies I'm going to present are from the cycling perspective, but similar arguments can be made for walking and walkable built environments. And in fact, I'm going to present some elements of my research that address that as well. So starting out with the first question, is active transportation healthy for everyone? And if we're going to open ourselves up to the possibility that active transportation is not healthy, it's useful to think about why that might be, because it kind of goes against this norm, this idea of walking and cycling being good for physical activity and for health outcomes. And while that might be true, there are different settings that people walk and cycle in. And we can tell that there's a qualitative difference between, say, cycling in this environment where the cyclists have a protected space for them to ride out of close proximity with motor vehicle traffic. In this environment where someone is still gaining the physical activity benefits of cycling, which is great, which is helpful and good for health, but lacks the dedicated infrastructure that separates them from motor vehicle traffic. And so cycling in this setting can be associated with greater injury risk and greater pollution exposure during a time when somebody is being physically active, which is great, but it also means that their inhalation rate is greater. And so their exposure to pollution is kind of doubly bad. And so what this means is that there are trade-offs in our cycling, the health impacts of cycling and walking activity in different environments. So while these activities can be good from the perspective of physical activity, they might pose risks in terms of pollution exposure and greater potential for injury. Now, fortunately, I'm not the first person who has asked these questions. And in fact, we have a pretty good framework called the Health Impact Assessment Framework. Some of you might be familiar with this, to really grapple with these types of trade-offs and to analyze the potential impacts of policies, programs, investments, plans with respect to their health impacts. And so fortunately, we've had several studies that have come out recently that have said, okay, we recognize that cycling is good for physical activity, but also comes at the potential expense of pollution exposure and injury risk. But the pros outweigh the cons. And so through the HIA framework of dealing with those trade-offs, they've said that the benefits outweigh the risks of this activity. And this is encouraging, but it's important to recognize that this research and these analyses have been done at the population level. And so what they will do is for an entire city that's represented by this hypothetical rectangle here, they have a single measure of physical activity benefits, air pollution exposure, and injury risk for an entire community, an entire city or region. When in fact, if we kind of look back at the images that we just saw, we know that these things actually vary across space. Not every space within our community is equally safe for walking and cycling, and our infrastructure characteristics influence that injury risk and our pollution exposure. And so what we're likely to see is something that looks like the image on the right here, that if we divided our hypothetical rectangular city up into a finer scale grid, we would actually probably see reason to vary our pollution exposure measure and our injury risk measure across space. Okay? And so if we do that, and we suspect that there are going to be differences in the socio-demographic characteristics of places with better versus worse infrastructure, I think this conversation becomes really important from an equity perspective. Those spatial variations are likely to be tied to social variations in a way that has equity implications. Okay, so cycling, while on the whole might be good for health, it's possible that some populations are going to face greater pollution exposure and greater injury risk, and only by looking at that finer scale can we assess the equity implications of making that statement. And so this is where some of my emerging research or current research is headed. But I want to present a couple of studies that I've done that kind of provide a rationale for looking at this. And one is a study on access to bike lanes and considering the distribution of cycling infrastructure in US cities. And so if we think that infrastructure characteristics influence pollution exposure, and exposure to injury risk through cycling in proximity to motor vehicle traffic. One way to, hopefully avoid that or mitigate that is to have bike lanes. But from an equity perspective, we have unequal access to bike lanes in our cities. And so in this analysis, what I did is I looked at associations between where bike lanes were located, the socio-demographic characteristics of those places, and levels of bicycle commuting in 22 of the largest US cities that are shown in this map and then listed out to the right. I measured bike lanes using data from local and regional GIS websites, and I also had access in some of the cities to a longitudinal built environment database that went back to 1990. And so that'll become important in one of the later analyses that I present. And I measured socio-demographic characteristics and a number of covariates using data from the American Community Survey and the US Census. And so this was a study with a lot of layers, a lot of variables, and a lot of different facets of the analysis. But I'm just going to present, one table from this entire study. But I think it's a table that really illustrates the key takeaways from this research. This is a descriptive analysis, but it looked at the characteristics of block groups in the US that do have bike lanes compared to those who do not. There's a lot of numbers here, but just to quickly walk through it, what we can see is that compared to block groups that don't have bike lanes, those that do have bike lanes had lower percentages of Black and Hispanic residents and lower percentages of residents in poverty. And compared to those without bike lanes, those that had bike lanes had higher average income or median income, higher educational attainment, and higher composite socioeconomic status through an index that I created. And this is something that kind of was echoed throughout a lot of the findings of this overall study and just really kind of hit home in this first table of descriptive statistics. So bike lanes tended to be more common in areas with lower percentages of Black and Hispanic residents and lower poverty rates, and to be more common in places with higher income, higher educational attainment, and higher composite SES. And of course, we know that a lot of other things influence the location of bike lanes. And it's just important to note, I won't go into the deep details here, that many of these relationships persist even after I controlled for things like population density, distance from downtown, bicycle commuting levels in the previous decade, the age structure of the population, all these other things that we think matter in where infrastructure ends up getting placed. So what this says is that bike lanes, which help protect against the health risks of cycling, are less likely to be located in areas with lower socio-demographic advantage. The next project that I recently completed it kind of broadened this to look at who faces other environmental barriers to walking and cycling. And so this is motivated by, the majority of past research in this area has looked at connections between the built environment and active travel behavior. And has said, can images such as environments such as the one represented on the right be places where we can encourage walking and cycling? There's been some research, including the research I just presented on the distribution of infrastructure, such as bike lanes. And there's been a lot of qualitative research actually on institutional issues in the planning and advocacy process and kind of what those mean for barriers to participation in the process of deciding where infrastructure ends up. But some key gaps that were missing in this literature were barriers measured at a finer scale. So as an example, in the study I just presented, I looked at whether a bike lane was available, but I didn't know anything about the quality of that bike lane, whether it was actually safe, or whether, as we see in an image here on the right, it just suddenly ends and throws you into traffic. Can't really get at that information from just a GIS file that tells us where bike lanes are located. Since there's not a lot of literature in these finer scale barriers to walking and cycling, there's not much research on disparities in those characteristics either. And then what's also missing in the literature is an analysis of whether these types of barriers could influence the health benefits of cycling and walking. So whether walking and cycling in deficient environments and unsafe environments has a net negative impact on health. And so in this study, I asked 3 research questions. I'm going to mainly present the results for cycling just for simplicity, but there was a lot of overlap and the findings were very similar for walking. But first ask who walks and cycles, who reports barriers to walking and cycling, who experiences environmental barriers, and do those environmental barriers moderate associations between active transportation and health. And so the overall framework here is presented here on the right. In the first question, I'm interested in whether socio-demographic characteristics are associated with walking and cycling activity, whether different socio-demographic groups are more versus less likely to report barriers in their environment that make walking and cycling less safe or less convenient. And then third, assuming or at least hoping that we have this positive association between active transportation and health, does that relationship look different in the presence or absence of environmental barriers? Kind of getting back to that question of, is cycling healthy in all contexts? And is that context kind of correlated with socio-demographic characteristics? And I asked these questions using data from the most recent iteration of the National Household Travel Survey, which asked participants the number of walking and cycling trips they made in the past week. These were not combined. I just combined them for the purpose of this slide, but I did the walking analysis and the cycling analysis separately. They were also asked to report whether they experience barriers to walking and cycling more frequently. And so the types of barriers that they were asked about were infrastructure barriers, so lack of nearby trails or parks, sidewalks in poor condition or lacking, and then safety barriers, high traffic volumes and speeds, and adequate lighting. And I put these 3 asterisks here, not to say that this is a statistically significant variable, but to say that it's actually a pretty problematic one, because unfortunately the NHTS only asked people who reported a walking or cycling trip in the past week this question. So only current pedestrians and cyclists were asked about their barriers to walking and cycling, which is a big limitation because we know that people who aren't walking and cycling also experience barriers. In fact, that's probably a pretty good reason why they don't walk and cycle. So as I'll explain here in a moment, that had implications for how I set up the models for this research. But when the NHTS gives you lemons, they also give you lemonade because this was the very first time that the NHTS asked a question about health. It's a pretty limited question. Just participants were asked to self-report their general health status on a scale from poor to excellent, a 5-point scale. So not the most detailed measure, but a good step in the right direction that I'm hoping that the NHTS will continue on and build upon in future iterations. And then of course, they were also asked about socio-demographic characteristics. I measured a variety of them, but the ones I'm going to focus on in presenting these results are race and ethnicity, income, and educational attainment. And so I'm gonna, in this next slide, translate these 4 variables into the framework for this study. And so in terms of methods, I first conducted a set of descriptive analyses. First, comparing the socio-demographic characteristics of people who did versus did not report any active transportation trips or walking or cycling in the past week. And that answers that first research question about who walks and who cycles. And then a descriptive analysis, again, just comparing the socio-demographic characteristics of pedestrians and cyclists who did versus did not report environmental barriers to walking or cycling more often. And that's kind of the distribution of barriers, the second research question there. And then to take it a step further and to control for other things that might matter, I ran a series of adjusted regression models. And the first one was a Heckman selection model that predicted whether a traveler reported barriers, controlling for their selection into active transportation. And so this is, an implication from the way that the NHTS question was asked. So a Heckman selection model can help us account for a situation where a 0 in the barriers doesn't necessarily mean that somebody did not experience environmental barriers. It could mean that they just were not asked that question because they didn't report any walking or cycling trips. And so this was adjusted for a lot of other things that we think would influence environmental barriers and active transportation, and really got at those first 2 research questions. And then finally, I did an ordered logistic regression model that compared regression coefficients for 3 groups. So this regression predicted self-reported health status as the outcome. And it compared that status for 3 groups: those who did not engage in walking or cycling, those who walked or cycled and did not report barriers, and those who walked and cycled but did report barriers. And so overall, this goes back to assuming or hoping that we have this positive association between active transportation and health. Is that relationship modified? Does it depend on whether barriers are reported? Again, I'm going to focus on the findings for cycling just for simplicity here, but an overall very similar pattern of results was found for walking as well. And across the full sample of NHTS respondents, 8.3% had taken at least 1 cycling trip within the past week, which was encouraging. This included and grouped together recreational and utilitarian cycling. There weren't large differences in the 2 different types of cycling, so I grouped them together. And then among those who cycled, nearly 40% reported at least one of those infrastructure or safety related barriers to cycling more often. And there were differences in both of these values by race and ethnicity. So compared to the full sample where 8.3% of respondents cycled, non-Hispanic white respondents were more likely to cycle, and all other racial and ethnic groups were less likely to cycle. But then on the flip side, compared to the 39% of cyclists who reported a barrier, non-Hispanic white cyclists were less likely to report a barrier, and all other racial and ethnic categories were more likely to report a barrier to cycling more frequently. And this was particularly high among the non-Hispanic Asian population. Similar story for income with a bit more gradation. So compared to the full sample, those with low income were less likely to cycle. Those with higher income were more likely to cycle. But when they did cycle, cyclists with low income were more likely to report environmental barriers. Cyclists with high income were less likely to report those types of barriers. And then similarly for educational attainment, compared to the full sample, those with less than a bachelor's degree were less likely to cycle. Those with a bachelor's degree or more were more likely to cycle. There wasn't really a significant difference in their reporting of barriers, but in the full regression models where it's adjusted for other characteristics, there was a significant difference where those with a bachelor's degree were more likely to cycle and less likely to report barriers. And the same overall pattern of results held for walking as well. And so overall, what this means is that NHTS respondents of color and of low SES were generally less likely to cycle and walk, and were more likely to report environmental barriers to walking and cycling when they did engage in active transportation. And so what were the implications of this for health? Again, I used ordered logistic regression models to measure associations between cycling and barrier status and health for non-cyclists, cyclists who don't report barriers, and cyclists who do report barriers. And what I found was, on a somewhat positive note, compared to non-cyclists, both types of cyclists regardless of barrier status, tended to report a greater health status represented by this positive coefficient. But what's interesting to note is that the coefficient was significantly greater for cyclists who didn't report barriers. So the potential health impacts of cycling appeared to be nearly twice as great for cyclists who didn't report barriers. And so what this indicated, and again, I found this for walking as well, is that associations between active transportation and health tend to be weaker in the presence of barriers. And so cycling in unsafe and unsatisfactory conditions, walking in the same vein, could positively influence health, but maybe not to the extent that it does for those without barriers. And so what this does is it really provides a justification for changing our health impact assessment process to, instead of looking at the city level, recognizing that there are gradations over space and across socioeconomic groups of who experiences safe versus unsafe conditions and healthy versus unhealthy conditions for walking and cycling. And so this is where my research is headed next, where I'm actually working with some collaborators to develop a finer scale estimate of pollution exposure and injury risk across an entire city, and then correlate that fine scale measure of risk with socio-demographic characteristics to see whether cycling is actually healthy across all areas of the city and all socioeconomic groups within the city. And then just briefly turning to the second question of whether infrastructure investment can support health equity. And so if we have deficiencies in infrastructure, particularly for our marginalized communities that are negatively impacting health, can we resolve this through our infrastructure investment? Can we build bike lanes in marginalized communities as a way to support public health and safer walking and cycling? And so one way to look at this is whether bike lanes could have differential impacts in different communities. So bike lane investment could have different meanings and different impacts in different socio-demographic settings. And so I use the same data set that I mentioned before to analyze this relationship. And so what I did here is I said, okay, if we hope and expect that we have this positive association between bike lane presence and bicycle commuting, is that relationship moderated by socio-demographic advantage? Really stated simply and kind of loose and playing fast and loose with the causal language, do bike lanes have greater impacts on cycling in some communities versus others? And so I'm just going to present a couple of graphics from this research. And so one is the associations I found where my measure of socio-demographic advantage was poverty. And so what this shows is the kind of marginal effects of bike lane presence across the spectrum of poverty percentages. And so in this diagram here, the solid black line represents associations between poverty and the probability of bicycle commuting when bike lanes are present, and the dash line shows that same association when bike lanes are not present. So anytime the solid line is above the dash line, bike lanes are positively associated with cycling. That's what we would like to see, that places with bike lanes have higher levels of bicycle commuting than those without bike lanes. The shaded region here in kind of this light pink is the range of poverty for which that relationship is statistically significant. So what we can see here is that bike lanes do appear to be positively associated with cycling, but only up to a certain poverty level. So once we pass the threshold of 50% of the population being in poverty, that relationship is no longer statistically significant. It does kind of look like it gets inverse here, that places with bike lanes are less likely to have bicycle commuting, but it's important to note that that is not statistically significant from zero. So what we're looking at here, just very simply, is that yes, bike lanes do appear to be associated with more cycling, but only in places with relatively low levels of poverty. And similarly, and just on the flip side of that, I did the same thing, but for my measure of socioeconomic status, this composite SES indicator. And we see that, again, for a certain range of our SES index, the solid line is greater than the dash line. So that means that bike lanes are positively associated with bicycle commuting. Places with bike lanes have more bicycle commuting than places without. But that relationship is only statistically significant at higher levels of this SES index. So the impact of bike lanes in both of these examples appears to increase and become more positive in places that have a more advantaged socioeconomic profile. And so again, I'm presenting a very small slice of this overall study, but basically what this study found was that positive associations between bike lane infrastructure and bike commuting levels became stronger with increasing socio-demographic advantage and were weaker in communities that we might describe as marginalized. And so there are a lot of potential explanations for this, but the one that I think is probably the most likely and the most compelling is that infrastructure is just one of the many barriers to cycling that marginalized communities face. There are personal and structural barriers, such as the cost of owning and maintaining and using a bicycle, our urban spatial structure, where we've had more suburbanization of poverty and longer commute distances for those populations, so they just might not be able to commute by bicycle because it's too far. Environmental barriers, lack of other support. So tying to the previous study, that just having a bike lane present doesn't mean that it's safe, that it is convenient, and that the environment in general is conducive to cycling. There's social barriers, so there's fears of discrimination and racial profiling while cycling, fears of crime, social norms. Different communities kind of have different perspectives on whether cycling is a good or a bad thing. And then a lot of institutional barriers. So concerns about bike lane investment and gentrification and the low representation of marginalized communities in the planning and advocacy profession and in the public meetings that go into making these decisions. So if we only focus on infrastructure investment, but we don't also address these other barriers that these communities face, then we could simply be widening the gap and making it easier and more convenient for people who are already healthier and were already going to cycle anyways to cycle more while leaving other communities further behind. And then the last study I'm going to present really dives into that last box, the institutional barriers, and considers associations between active transportation investment and gentrification. And so this is another way of complicating our question of whether infrastructure investment can support health equity. What happens when we try to create healthier environments and safer environments for walking and particularly cycling? And this research was motivated by resistance that I saw to bike lanes in traditionally disadvantaged neighborhoods in several large US cities, enough to where we saw a Washington Post article that asked why bike lanes are such heated symbols of gentrification. And fortunately, there's a good body of qualitative research that went into this and has found that gentrification concerns might be literal. It might be an actual concern that bike lanes are going to bring gentrification, or it could be symbolic, that there are a lot of changes that happen in communities that have to do with gentrification. But bike lanes are one of the few that actually has a public input process as part of building that infrastructure. And so these processes kind of become a platform for expressing larger community concerns. It could result from this institutional mismatch between planners and the communities they serve. And it can result, I think, in large part from the way that we frame these types of investments. And to see the impacts of that, we can really go back to that same kind of environment. And we see that this bike lane investment or this person cycling is doing so in an environment that appears to have undergone a lot of recent development, potentially redevelopment. And we see these types of images all the time in advocating for a bike lane investment and community revitalization. And so we see bike lanes framed as economic development. Bike lanes are going to increase local spending. They're going to increase property values. They're going to help us attract the creative class of young talent to our cities. And while this is helpful for justifying investment in the context of limited resources, it also raises important questions about who belongs in these spaces and who's intended to benefit from these infrastructure investments. And so while we had a good deal of qualitative research in this area, there was a lack of quantitative research. And so what I did in the study is use that data set again, but looked at three cities, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Oakland, where I had longitudinal built environment data and measured associations between bike lane investment and gentrification over time. And again, just going to present a couple pieces of this larger study, but one table that I think represents it pretty well is this descriptive breakdown of for each city and each decade, where bike lanes were most likely to end up. And I categorize block groups into three categories. So those that were disadvantaged at the start of a decade, but didn't get more advantaged or gentrify over time. Those that were already advantaged, so they weren't eligible to gentrify, and those that were gentrifying over time. And so I found that in Chicago, in the 1990s and early 2000s, bike lanes were more likely to go to block groups that were already advantaged, so that were already higher income, higher socioeconomic status. And then in that last kind of mini decade between 2010 and 2015, they were most likely to go to block groups that were gentrifying, so that were increasing in advantage from a kind of low baseline. So, more simply, poorer areas that were becoming more wealthy over time with potential displacement concerns. In Minneapolis, there was a little bit of a different story each decade. Minneapolis was a bit of the more difficult city to place here. In the 90s, bike lanes were most likely to go to disadvantaged block groups. The 2000s, they were most likely to go to already advantaged block groups, and later on they were most likely to go to gentrifying block groups. And then Oakland was the simpler case, that in all 3 decades here, bike lane investment was most likely to happen in block groups that were gentrifying over time. And so I mentioned that this was a descriptive analysis, and so I also did a regression analysis that accounted for the data structure and other covariates. But basically what I found was that in Chicago and Minneapolis, compared to disadvantaged, kind of persistently disadvantaged block groups, bike lanes were more likely to go to those that were already advantaged. And in Oakland, this is kind of combining across decades, bike lane investment was most likely to be made in gentrifying areas. Minneapolis, there was actually less bike lane investment in gentrifying areas. That's why that square is red there. I don't want to get too much into the potential reasons for that, but there's some potential explanations that I think are interesting. So overall, in this study, I found some evidence that bike lane investment was more likely to happen in places that were either already advantaged or becoming more advantaged over time. And so there's this kind of problematic association between our infrastructure investment and neighborhood demographic change. And then it's useful to note that I did some other analyses within this data and suggest that, if we think about this, which came first? Does gentrification bring bike lane investment? Does bike lane investment attract wealthier residents and lead to gentrification? I found more evidence that gentrification happened first or during the same decade as bike lane investment, and less evidence for this idea that bike lanes came first or bike lanes kind of caused gentrification. But even if there's an association, that's something that's problematic and that we need to deal with it in our public processes. So pulling it all together, going back to these 2 questions, is active transportation healthy for everyone? And can infrastructure investment support health equity? I think that my response to both of these questions as a true academic is it depends. But I think it's a meaningful it depends. It's not just a statistical one. It depends on how we do it and how we involve our communities in the process. So for the first question, is active transportation healthy for everyone? I found that there are disparities in access to bike lanes, and that this is important because we know that cycling in the absence of bike lanes might not be as healthy as it is in other settings. I also found that there are disparities in the other types of environmental barriers that individuals report. So we know that just having access to a bike lane is important, but that bike lane should also be safe and convenient. And there are disparities in these finer grain measures of infrastructure quality as well. And that these environmental barriers might weaken the potential health impacts or health benefits of cycling. And so this points to a critical need for us to examine the health trade-offs of cycling through the lens of social equity, to take that health impact assessment framework and say, do the pros outweigh the cons, not just for the city as a whole, but for everyone within the city? And are there places where cycling is actually a net health risk? And if so, how can we invest in those areas to make cycling safe and healthy? And as we do so, though, we need to really critically consider whether just putting infrastructure, throwing infrastructure at the problem is going to really support health equity. And this is important to consider because associations between infrastructure and active transportation might be stronger in more advantaged places and weaker in places that face a lot of other barriers to cycling that if we only focus on infrastructure, we're not adequately addressing. And we need to recognize that investing in active transportation infrastructure might be associated with gentrification. And even if this is not a causal relationship, it's something that is important to think about. And so there's a critical need here to address the non-infrastructure barriers alongside our infrastructure investments, and to proactively work with communities through better public engagement, more ground up procedures to address gentrification concerns as we invest in active transportation infrastructure. And so that's all I have today. I'm happy to take any questions that you have. I hope, are people there?
Hi, Lindsay, it's Angelique.
Oh, hi, okay, I had this like moment of fear that I'd given this presentation.
I raised my hand. I wasn't sure if this
okay, I can see that now. Okay, thank you.
I was just curious if economic equity is included in this equity topic, because as you mentioned, with respect to the impoverished community, it's a combination of they typically live farther than their location, and biking tends to be, a secondary mode that they would choose rather than public transit.
Yeah.
So how would you, if that economic equity is considered, because it's hard to place biking infrastructure there if it's far, and if, the given money they have per month is better to be used towards public transit than a personal use of bicycles.
Yes. So that's kind of the rationale. That's like my interpretation of some of my results, and the whole rationale for, yes, bike lane investment can support health, and it can be a good thing, but on its own, it's not going to work for a lot of communities. And so again, if we see, oh, this is a neighborhood where residents are have low socioeconomic status, so let's build bike lanes there because they've historically not had them, and they need them. Well, if they live too far away from their workplace, which is, as you mentioned, has a great deal to do with the larger economic structure of our urban centers, then that infrastructure isn't really going to help. And it might in fact help people that are just passing through that community, but those residents might not be able to benefit from it because their trip is just too far. And so, there's not a great, I guess I just want to, and I try to encourage people to not see this kind of as a one size fits all or a panacea for increasing cycling, because there are a lot of other barriers that might be better addressed by other modes or by other types of investments. So I think that's a really important point and a really important takeaway from the evidence that I found.
Thank you. And then leading into, I think your statement. So with respect to the communities that can benefit to this, do you envision that generally this will be more implemented on downtown areas, that last mile problem? Because introducing a lot of bike lanes, say in a heavy, on a road condition that caters more to cars, will create more traffic if we increase bikers, if you may.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and it's also about like the land use context. Where does it make sense to invest in bike lanes? Where are trips going to be short enough that they can really be served by bicycle transportation? And a lot of that investment does happen to be in more central areas of the city. Some of the active transportation investments that have gone to more outlying areas might be more in the form of trails, like from a recreational perspective. But the investments in bike lanes that aim to provide connectivity are going to be more likely to be made downtown. And I did control in most of these studies for distance to downtown to kind of account for that. But if we think about it in terms of practice, then yeah, this is more likely to be a city issue. And in fact, I only looked at, in most of these, I only looked at the city limits of these places, not some of the more outlying areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I see Javier had his hand raised, I believe. Or maybe not. Gabriel?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
First, that was me making some noise earlier on in the presentation. Sorry about that.
Oh no, that's fine.
I forgot that to mute my audio.
No, that's fine. My toddler was making some noise during the middle too, so
Okay.
I apologize.
So I'm wondering, like, if bike lanes, if it depends whether they're helpful or not, and certainly it seems like in some situations they might not be. What other sorts of, in those situations, what other sorts of things might a city planner want to look at? And I'm curious, like, how many of those are like transportation infrastructure things, and how many of them are something else?
Great question. And I feel like, yeah, I did kind of leave this as we need to address things other than infrastructure without getting into what those things should be. And so I think it's difficult to address some of the, at least in the short term, some of the structural things like people living far from work. But better integrating bike infrastructure and bicycle use with public transit, and so really making efforts to do first last mile connectivity in a really conscious and convenient way. Maybe even providing discounts on transit for people who ride their bikes or combine with a bike share trip. And so that's something that can kind of address, just in some ways, that larger structural issue. A lot of the things that are barriers, I think, are really difficult to address just in a kind of straightforward, like outcome-oriented way. I think that the planning process is really important. So on the planning side, we would think about, okay, gentrification is something that we don't think bike lanes cause. We recognize that they're associated with it. That doesn't mean that we can just step away and write off those concerns. What it might mean is that planners need to be talking to affordable housing advocates and anti-displacement groups, and really kind of owning up to this idea that, you know, we're not the cause of the problem, but we're part of it, and we need to recognize that and partner across disciplines with people who are working on these issues with communities that we're, you know, contributing to, among others. So I think a lot of them in the planning side comes down to processes that like better engage communities, that don't just come in with drawings of here's what we're going to do, but really start with communities talking about the problems that they have. And one of my favorite examples is in Asheville, North Carolina. There was a community that was getting a greenway, and a lot of the planners kept getting a lot of pushback from lower income residents. And finally, the planners threw up their hands. They're like, "What kind of transportation investment do you want here?" And they said, "We want a grocery store." And so it was just a really good illustration of communities have much deeper needs than active transportation infrastructure. And B, they don't always understand that the same pot of money can't be used to build a grocery store than it can, a greenway. But, you know, what planners can do in that situation is, even though they can't just transfer their funds to build a grocery store, they can partner with and kind of talk to the people who are leading that charge and that have influence on that decision. So we just shouldn't see like planning or bikes, you know, engineering as in a silo, just because we can't directly influence something that is a community concern. But partnerships are really important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm here. I just had some trouble unmuting.
Oh, hello. I hear you now.
Okay, my question is about gentrification. Could you elaborate on how that is quantified or measured?
Yes, that's a great question, and I measured it in a few different ways. But the one that I presented was through if anyone's familiar with it, Lance Freeman developed a measure in 2005, and so it's based on. This one is based on indicators of socioeconomic status. It's not based on race. what it does is it groups census tracts, and then I translate that into block groups into gentrifying or not gentrifying based on where they started out the decade. So in order to be eligible to gentrify, it had to be like disadvantaged at the start of the decade. So it had to have, say, lower income and lower educational attainment than the region that it's situated within. So there's some variables that are, okay, how did this block group start out? And then there are some criteria for what happened over time. So it also had to have an increase in income or an increase in educational attainment that exceeded the increase that the region as a whole experienced. And it had to have an increase in real housing values over time. So basically a few different economic indicators measured at the start of the decade to see whether they started out in a disadvantaged status, and then over the course of the decade, how did they change relative to the change of the larger community? And so it isolated those. It pretty much allowed you to classify some tract as gentrifying if it started out as low SES and it had an increase over time that was greater than the increase that was already happening in the rest of the community.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if I see any others.
I don't think there is any more questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Braun, for this very nice presentation, and I hope to see you soon.
Okay, I hope to see you all soon. Everyone stay well, and thanks for being here virtually.